In a quiet African village, there lived a man everyone trusted, Pastor Emmanuel. With his warm smile and calming words, he was more than just a preacher. He was a healer. People believed the herbs he prepared could cure sickness, and they came from far and wide to seek his touch. Families offered gifts, travelers carried testimonies, and the pastor's name became a blessing on many lips. But beneath the respect and reverence, a secret was buried deep within his farm, a secret that would shatter the faith of an entire village. This is the story of how one discovery changed everything. Stay with me through each chapter as we uncover what really happened. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. In the heart of the village stood a humble church, its mud walls weathered by time, and its wooden cross leaning slightly as though bowed in reverence. The man who led that church was Pastor Emmanuel, a figure who carried himself with quiet dignity and kindness that drew people closer with every passing day. He was not wealthy, nor did he carry himself with the grandeur that some expected from a man of faith, but his gentle nature and the way he listened to every problem made him loved by young and old alike. For many, Emmanuel was more than a pastor. He was the glue that held the community together. When disputes arose, it was his voice of calm that soothed tempers. When families fell into despair, it was his prayers that rekindled hope. And when sickness swept through homes, it was his herbs that seemed to bring comfort where medicine was scarce. The pastor had learnt about herbs from his late grandmother, a wise woman who believed that nature held remedies for many afflictions. Emmanuel took her lessons to heart, and as he grew older, he refined his knowledge, blending it with his faith to offer healing that was both physical and spiritual. People said his hands carried a kind of blessing, for when he touched the sick and gave them his herbs, they often found relief. Some said it was his knowledge of plants, while others swore it was his prayers that made the difference. But no one doubted that the man was special. Mothers brought children with fevers, farmers came limping with injuries, and the elderly sought his remedies for aching bones. Each time, Emmanuel welcomed them without asking for payment, only requesting that they pray and live in peace with one another. His little church was not only a place of worship, but also a sanctuary of healing. Travelers from nearby villages began to arrive, hearing whispers of a pastor whose herbs cured where doctors failed. With time, Emmanuel's name spread beyond his small community, and his presence became almost legendary. He was not just a pastor anymore. He was the embodiment of hope for people who had little else to cling to. The villagers felt proud to call him their own, cherishing the idea that they lived in a place blessed with such a man. Yet, as often happens when admiration grows too high, a shadow of doubt quietly lingered among a few, unnoticed beneath the loud praises. For now, however, Pastor Emmanuel was untouchable, a man who seemed to walk with both God and the healing secrets of the earth. The stories of Pastor Emmanuel's healing spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of market women, traveling traders, and families who had experienced what they called miracles. There was the story of old Mama Ruth, whose eyesight had been fading for years until she visited Emmanuel. He gave her a mixture of herbs steeped in hot water, and within days, she claimed she could see the path to her farm more clearly. Then there was young Chaik, a boy struck with a lingering cough that left him weak and unable to run with his friends. His desperate mother brought him to the pastor, who offered a concoction with honey and crushed leaves. Soon after, the boy was back on his feet, chasing chickens and laughing with the other children. These tales added to the aura of mystery around the pastor, strengthening the belief that he possessed more than just knowledge of plants. He carried divine favor. People began arriving in groups, some traveling long distances on foot, bringing with them tokens of gratitude, baskets of yams, fresh palm wine, woven mats, and sometimes even coins. Emmanuel never demanded payment, but the offerings were given with such sincerity that he accepted them with a smile and a prayer. The small compound around his church buzzed with activity as men, women, and children waited patiently for their turn to see the pastor. He moved among them with ease, offering kind words, praying for families, and handing out herbs with careful instructions. Each visit ended with a sense of reassurance, as though the weight of suffering had been lightened. The villagers believed he was chosen, and, in their hearts, his word became law. They trusted him not only with their ailments, but with their secrets, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Even those who were not particularly religious found themselves drawn to him, convinced that the herbs he used held powers beyond ordinary understanding. Parents brought their children not only for healing but for blessings, hoping Emmanuel's touch would guard them from harm. Travelers returned home with stories that grew more wondrous with each retelling, until the pastor's name carried an almost mythical quality. But with every miracle came questions that were seldom voiced aloud. Some villagers wondered how Emmanuel always had the right herbs in abundance, regardless of the season. Others noticed that while most of his plants grew openly, there were sections of his farmland he seldom allowed anyone to enter. Yet the gratitude of the healed drowned out such suspicions. To the majority, he was a man sent by God, and they believed questioning him was like questioning heaven itself. For now, the doubts remained whispers, while the faith in Emmanuel's healing touch only grew stronger, binding the village to him more tightly than ever before. As months passed, the small gatherings outside Pastor Emmanuel's home swelled into throngs that could no longer be contained within the dusty courtyard of the church. What once began as a trickle of neighbors seeking remedies soon became a steady stream of visitors from distant villages, towns, and even cities where whispers of the healing pastor had reached. Some arrived limping, others were carried on mats by family members, and many came simply in hope that his touch might ward off sickness before it could even begin. The road leading into the village grew busier each week, lined with footprints, donkey carts, and weary travelers bearing gifts of gratitude. The villagers themselves watched with a mixture of pride and amazement. For the first time in memory, their little community was no longer hidden in obscurity. People who had once mocked them as simple country folk now traveled miles just to set foot on their soil, believing it blessed by the presence of Emmanuel. Local traders rejoiced at the change, for more visitors meant fuller baskets and brisker sales. Market days, once modest affairs, now buzzed with activity as merchants from other regions joined in, selling food, fabrics, and charms to those who came seeking both healing and opportunity. It wasn't only the sick who came. Leaders from other towns sent envoys with messages of respect, hoping to secure ties with the man they called the Shepherd of Miracles. Emmanuel greeted them all with humility, never raising his voice, never demanding more than what was freely offered. His modesty made him even more beloved, and soon the crowds began to see him as something beyond human, a man chosen for a divine mission. Some villagers even whispered that he might one day be remembered as a saint. Yet, beneath the surface of admiration, a few sharp-eyed observers noticed the strain it brought. The once quiet churchyard was often overcrowded, and disputes would break out among those desperate to see him first. Emmanuel bore the weight with patience, walking tirelessly among the people, speaking to each as though they were the only one in the world who mattered. Still, questions lingered. How could one man provide remedies for so many? Where did the endless supply of herbs come from? And why did Emmanuel keep certain parts of his farmland carefully fenced, with warnings not to tread there? Most brushed aside such doubts, swept up in the fervor of his growing fame. The village itself basked in borrowed glory, as if the pastor's light reflected upon them all. Children sang songs using his name, mothers prayed blessings upon him at dawn, and elders marveled that their humble community had been chosen for such an honor. For them, Emmanuel's work was a sign of God's favor, a gift they had been entrusted to share with the world. Few dared to imagine that the very secret fueling this extraordinary rise might one day unravel everything they cherished. For now, the people celebrated, blind to the storm that brewed quietly in the shadows of Emmanuel's guarded land. The market was the heartbeat of the village, a place where laughter, bargaining, and the rhythmic sounds of pestles pounding yam echoed through the air. It was here that the earliest doubts about Pastor Emmanuel began to stir, carried not in shouts but in hushed voices between stalls. At first, no one dared to speak against the man so widely revered, but small observations slipped into conversations like seeds waiting for the right soil to take root. A trader from a neighboring town was the first to raise an eyebrow. He had come to deliver palm oil and noticed that, while the pastor's herbs were plentiful, they looked unusually lush, as though untouched by drought or insects that plagued every other farmer's crops. "Does he plant in heaven's soil?" the man muttered to a local woman, who quickly hushed him, fearing the villagers would not tolerate such questioning. Yet, she too had wondered how Emmanuel's leaves never withered, how his roots always seemed fresh, no matter the season. The whispers grew stronger when children, curious and mischievous, returned from playing near the pastor's farmland. They spoke of tall, unfamiliar plants hidden behind a line of ordinary herbs. They had only glimpsed them through gaps in the fence, but their wide eyes and hushed tones sparked curiosity among the adults. At first, the villagers dismissed the stories as childish imagination, but as more children repeated similar accounts, unease crept into the market talk. "Perhaps it is just another rare healing plant," some reasoned, though doubt lingered. Then came the tale of an elderly farmer named Okechukwu, who swore he had once seen Emmanuel carrying bundles of herbs late at night instead of during the day like everyone else. "Why would a man of God toil in darkness if his work is pure?" he asked. His words drew frowns and uncomfortable silence. Some insisted he must be mistaken, while others shifted uneasily, unwilling to voice the same suspicion aloud. The pastor's fame had risen so high that questioning him felt like questioning God himself. Still, human nature is restless, and gossip moves swiftly when shrouded in mystery. The market became divided, one half clinging to Emmanuel's image as a saint, the other secretly wondering what truly lay behind his fences. To the faithful, his secrecy was nothing more than humility, a way to guard his sacred knowledge. To the doubters, it was the first crack in a picture that had once seemed flawless. Yet even the most skeptical dared not confront him directly, for the fear of being labeled ungrateful or faithless was too great. And so, the whispers lived in shadows, fed by curiosity and guarded by fear. Children listened as their mothers traded hushed rumors along with vegetables, while elders shook their heads and insisted the pastor should not be questioned. But in every corner of the marketplace, one truth was clear. Something about Emmanuel's herbs was not as simple as it seemed. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and soon they would grow into revelations too heavy to ignore. Among the children who often played near Pastor Emmanuel's farmland was a boy named Kelechi. At 13, he was known for his restless curiosity, the kind of child who could not pass a locked door without wondering what lay behind it. His mother, a widow who sold groundnuts in the market, often scolded him for poking into matters that were not his concern. But Kelechi's sharp eyes and restless spirit made him notice things others overlooked. For weeks, he had watched Emmanuel's fenced-off section of land, the part no one was allowed to enter. Unlike the open plots where ordinary herbs grew in neat rows, this patch was always hidden, shielded by tall wooden stakes and thorny vines woven together to discourage wandering feet. One afternoon, while chasing a goat that had strayed too far, Kelechi stumbled close to the fence. Curiosity tugged at him, stronger than caution. He pressed his small frame against the gaps between the wood, peering into the forbidden section. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Tall, green plants swaying slightly in the breeze, their leaves broad and pointed. But the longer he stared, the stranger they seemed. These were not the herbs his mother boiled for fevers, nor the leaves women crushed for poultices. Their shape was different, their smell sharper, almost intoxicating even from a distance. Kelechi crouched low, trying to get a better view. The soil inside looked darker, richer than the dry earth outside, and the plants grew thick, almost wild. His heart pounded with excitement and unease. He had never seen such crops before, and though he couldn't name them, instinct told him they were not meant for children's games or village remedies. Just as he leaned closer, a sound startled him, the creak of footsteps approaching. Emmanuel's voice drifted through the still air, humming a hymn softly as he neared the hidden farm. Kelechi froze, his breath caught in his throat. If the pastor found him there, what would happen? He scrambled back, leaving the goat forgotten, and ran until the fence disappeared from sight. That evening, he told his closest friend what he had seen. The boy listened with wide eyes, but urged him to keep quiet. If you say such things, people will think you are lying, his friend warned. Yet Kelechi could not shake the image of the strange leaves waving like silent sentinels in the wind. The discovery clung to him, making him restless in the days that followed. Whenever he saw Emmanuel smiling at the villagers, handing out herbs with gentle hands, the memory of that secret garden whispered in his mind. The boy's tale slowly found its way into whispers among other children, and from them into the ears of adults who already carried doubts. Though most dismissed it as childish imagination, some found their suspicions deepening. What plants was Emmanuel tending so carefully that no one could enter? Why did he hum to himself as he walked the fields at night? Kelechi's discovery was small, but it had unlocked a door the village could no longer ignore. And behind that door, a secret waited, growing in silence. The whispers that began with Kelechi's discovery did not fade. Instead, they clung to the village like mist, seeping into evening conversations around cooking fires and gatherings under the moon. A few villagers, unsettled by what they had heard, decided they could no longer live with unanswered questions. If Pastor Emmanuel truly had nothing to hide, then the truth would clear itself. But if the boy's story was true, then the man they revered might not be who they believed. And so, one quiet night, when the moon was high and the crickets sang their endless chorus, a small group of men resolved to follow Emmanuel and uncover what he guarded so fiercely. Among them was Okechukwu, the old farmer, who had once claimed to see Emmanuel working in the dark. With him were two younger men, strong enough to move quickly if they needed to, but careful not to alert the pastor. They waited until the village lay in slumber, when only the barking of distant dogs broke the silence. Emmanuel's lantern appeared like a glowing orb in the distance, bobbing gently as he made his way toward the hidden farm. His steps were steady, his head bowed as though in prayer, and his voice carried softly, humming the same hymn Kelechi had once heard. The men followed at a distance, their bare feet pressing silently against the earth. As Emmanuel approached the fence section, he unlocked a small wooden gate and slipped inside. The men drew closer, crouching low behind a cluster of bushes. What they saw when the lantern's light fell upon the plants inside left them stunned. The strange crops stretched high above Emmanuel's shoulders, their jagged leaves glistening in the night air. The pastor moved among them with familiarity, touching each as though inspecting a flock of sheep. Every so often, he bent to cut leaves, placing them carefully into a sack. He worked methodically, his hymn never ceasing, as if the act was sacred. The watchers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them recognized the plant, yet all instinctively felt that it was not meant for healing. Its presence in such abundance, guarded so closely, made their hearts beat faster. Okechukwu's lips trembled as he whispered, "These are not herbs we know. What does he use them for?" But no one had the courage to answer. They only watched as Emmanuel continued his midnight ritual, unaware of the eyes fixed upon him. At last, the pastor gathered his field sack and locked the gate behind him. The men shrank back into the shadows as he walked past, his lantern flickering until it disappeared into the distance. For a long moment, the three sat in silence, shaken by what they had witnessed. They had no proof to present the village, only their word, and who would believe them over a man so beloved? Yet the image of those towering plants would not leave their minds. The truth they had sought was now a burden heavier than they expected. And though they returned home that night without speaking a word, each knew the secret could not remain hidden forever. The seed of revelation had been planted, and the harvest would come soon enough. It did not take long for the secret to slip from the shadows into the open. The three men who had followed Emmanuel that night tried to keep what they had seen hidden, but silence is fragile in a village where whispers move faster than wind. First, it leaked into cautious conversations among trusted friends, then into murmurs in the market, and soon the entire community buzzed with questions. Some dismissed the talk as jealous lies, while others, already uneasy from earlier suspicions, demanded the truth be brought to light. The tension grew until it could no longer be contained. The breaking point came one hot afternoon when a group of villagers decided to confront the matter directly. They gathered outside the pastor's farm, their voices uneasy but resolute. Emmanuel, returning from prayer in the church, found a crowd waiting, eyes fixed on the locked section of land. "Open it for us, Pastor," a man called. "Let us see with our own eyes what you have planted." His words were firm, but not yet hostile. At first, Emmanuel stood silent, his face calm, though his hands trembled slightly. He tried to assure them that his crops were nothing but herbs meant for healing, yet the crowd pressed harder. Fear of deceit had grown stronger than trust. Finally, under the weight of their demand, Emmanuel fetched his key and slowly opened the gate. A heavy stillness fell as the villagers stepped forward, their sandals crunching against the soil. And there it was, revealed in full daylight, rows upon rows of tall green plants, their serrated leaves swaying lazily in the afternoon breeze. The sharp, pungent smell filled the air, unfamiliar to most but unmistakable to a few who had traveled to the cities. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned. These were no ordinary herbs. They were weeds, the kind forbidden by law, the kind known to cloud minds and ruin lives. Gasps broke out, followed by angry shouts. Some could not believe their eyes, insisting it must be a mistake, while others pointed accusing fingers, their voices rising with betrayal. "All this time, was this what he gave us?" cried one woman clutching her child. "Were we trusting in God or in poison?" Emmanuel raised his hands, pleading for calm, but the damage was done. The sight of the hidden farm had pierced the veil of reverence that once shielded him. His name, once spoken with pride, now rolled off tongues with doubt and bitterness. The crowd swelled with emotion, some demanding answers, others turning away in tears. The revelation struck like a hammer against the faith they had built around him. For years, they had praised Emmanuel, celebrated him, trusted his touch, and now, before their very eyes, stood proof that the man they exalted as a healer had concealed something darker. Trust had been broken, and no prayer could sew it back together in that moment. The pastor's secret was no longer his alone. It belonged to the village, heavy and undeniable. The days that followed the discovery were heavy with silence. The once bustling compound of Pastor Emmanuel, where laughter and prayers used to echo, now stood nearly deserted. Only a few loyal followers came, clinging to the belief that there must be an explanation, but most of the villagers stayed away, their hearts torn between anger and sorrow. To them, it felt as though the ground beneath their feet had shifted. How could the man they trusted so deeply, the one they praised in songs and stories, have hidden such a thing? The disappointment cut sharper than any blade, for betrayal is deepest when it comes from those closest to the heart. In the market, the whispers turned to open debate. Some argued that Emmanuel's plants had indeed healed, pointing to children who had recovered and elders who found relief. Perhaps his ways were strange, but the results were real. One woman insisted as she arranged her tomatoes, but others shook their heads, their voices rising with bitterness. Healing built on lies is no blessing. An elder replied, "If he hid this from us, what else has he hidden?" The unity that once bound the village around their pastor fractured into suspicion and blame. Families argued over whether they should forgive him or cut ties completely. Children who once ran to greet Emmanuel now turned their faces away. Mothers who once sought his blessings now clutched their little ones closer, as if to shield them from his shadow. The church benches that used to overflow with worshippers stood half empty. The songs of praise reduced to hollow echoes. Emmanuel's name, once spoken with reverence, now carried a sting. Where there had been pride, shame crept in. Where there had been admiration, distrust took root. For Emmanuel, the weight of broken trust was heavier than chains. He still walked among the villagers, offering greetings with the same soft smile, but few returned them. He prayed aloud in the church, yet his words no longer stirred hearts. Even his herbs, once received with gratitude, were now rejected with suspicion. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and every act of kindness was reinterpreted through the lens of deceit. The man who had once seemed larger than life now appeared small, vulnerable, and painfully human. And yet, beneath the anger, there lingered something even more painful: grief. For many villagers, losing faith in Emmanuel felt like losing faith in themselves. They had trusted him, defended him, even celebrated him as a gift from God. To accept his secret meant accepting that they had been blind, that their devotion had been misplaced. It was not just Emmanuel who had fallen from grace. It was the entire village, left to wrestle with the sting of betrayal and the uneasy question of whether they had been complicit in their own deception. When the weight of silence grew unbearable, Pastor Emmanuel gathered the villagers in the churchyard where his journey as a healer had first begun. The sun hung low, painting the mud walls in a dim golden light, while the people sat with folded arms and guarded eyes. No one sang hymns that evening. No one raised their hands in prayer. They were waiting, not for blessings, but for answers. Emmanuel stood before them, his Bible clutched tightly, his face worn with sleepless nights. The man who had once commanded the crowd with calm authority now looked fragile, his shoulders heavy under the burden of broken trust. He began slowly, his voice unsteady, confessing that the strange plants he had grown were indeed forbidden weeds. A murmur swept through the crowd, but he raised a hand, asking them to let him finish. He explained that, years ago, when his grandmother first taught him the healing power of herbs, she also whispered of certain plants with stronger effects, plants that eased pain quickly, that calmed troubled minds, and that could bring relief when nothing else worked. Emmanuel admitted that he had turned to these crops in secret, believing he could control them and use them only for good. At first, he told them his intentions were pure. He saw children recover, fevers break, and suffering eased. But as more people came, he felt trapped. The crowds expected miracles every day, and the simple herbs were not always enough. So he leaned more heavily on the hidden plants, convincing himself that the end justified the means. "I feared that if I could not heal, you would lose faith in me, in God, and in this church," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I wanted to carry your burdens, but in doing so, I strayed from the path of truth." Some villagers wept quietly, torn between pity and anger. Others shook their heads, their faces hard with disappointment. One man shouted, asking why Emmanuel had not trusted the people enough to tell them the truth from the beginning. Emmanuel lowered his gaze, admitting that pride and fear had kept him silent. He had become addicted not to the plants themselves, but to the respect and reverence they brought him. To confess earlier would have meant watching his pedestal crumble, and he was too weak to face that fall. The pastor's words left the crowd in turmoil. For some, his honesty softened the sting of betrayal. They saw a man wrestling with weakness, not a monster intent on harm. For others, his confession only deepened the wound, for it proved he had known all along that he was deceiving them. Emmanuel stood before them, not as the untouchable figure they once adored, but as a flawed man pleading for forgiveness from those he had misled. His fate now rested not in his own hands, but in the hearts of the villagers who had once called him a saint. In the weeks after Emmanuel's confession, the village found itself standing at a crossroads. Anger had not disappeared overnight, nor had the sense of betrayal faded quickly. Some villagers avoided him completely, unwilling to forgive what they saw as a deliberate lie. Others, moved by his brokenness and his willingness to admit fault, argued that every man was capable of falling, and that grace was not meant only for the righteous, but for those who stumbled. The village was divided, yet through their heated discussions, one truth began to emerge. What they had experienced was a lesson not only about Emmanuel, but about themselves. The elders gathered the community beneath the ancient Iroko tree to speak openly. They reminded the people that trust, once broken, takes time to mend, but it should never blind one from learning. Blind faith, they said, can make a community strong, but it can also make it vulnerable. Emmanuel's rise to near sainthood had been fed not only by his actions but by their eagerness to exalt him without question. In their desire for hope and healing, they had stopped asking hard questions, believing that to doubt was the same as to disrespect. Now, they saw how dangerous such silence could be. Families began to talk more openly about the difference between faith in God and faith in man. Parents reminded their children that even the most respected leaders were human, prone to weakness and temptation. Emmanuel's story became a cautionary tale passed from one household to another. Not a tale meant to shame, but one meant to teach. Healing, they agreed, should never rest in the hands of one man alone, and the community pledged to seek wisdom together to balance reverence with accountability. For Emmanuel himself, the road was long and humbling. Stripped of the pedestal the villagers once placed him on, he returned to a quieter life. He still preached on Sundays, but the crowds were smaller and the gifts fewer. Some never came back to his church, while others chose to stay, not out of blind devotion, but out of a new, cautious hope that even a broken man could still guide them with honesty. Emmanuel worked his farm openly now, planting only the herbs everyone recognized and sharing his knowledge so others could grow them too. In this way, the healing that once flowed only through him slowly became the work of the entire village. In time, the pain of betrayal softened, leaving behind a lesson carved into the community's memory. They learned that no man, no matter how beloved, should be placed above truth. They learned that forgiveness is not weakness, but neither is accountability. And most of all, they learned that strength lies not in the gifts of one, but in the unity of many. The scandal that once threatened to break them had, in its own way, reshaped them into a stronger, wiser people. And though the shadow of Emmanuel's secret would never fully fade, the light of what they had learned would guide them for generations. And so, the tale of Pastor Emmanuel and his hidden secret comes to a close, leaving us with a reminder that trust is fragile and truth is the foundation upon which communities stand. Every story carries a lesson, and this one speaks of faith, forgiveness, and the importance of seeking wisdom beyond appearances. What do you think? Should the villagers have forgiven Pastor Emmanuel, or were they right to keep their distance? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Until then, stay blessed and keep the lessons of this story close to heart.